I first heard about the Blackbird in a quiet briefing room at Beale Air Force Base. The man who called me and didn't explain much on the phone, just said my name had come up on a list. When I walked in, there were 5 other men sitting in silence. No small talk. No smiles. Just that heavy feeling you get when you know you're somewhere you're not supposed to be. The room was cold. The walls were bare except for a clock that didn't seem to move. When the officer finally came in, he didn't waste time with introductions. He said one sentence that changed my life. "You've been selected for a program that doesn't officially exist." He didn't say State Route 71 or Blackbird. Not yet. He just talked about missions that would take us farther, faster, and higher than any other aircraft. Missions that, if they went wrong, would never make the news. We'd simply vanish, and our families would be told it was a training accident. I remember my hands sweating as he spoke, but I kept my face still. We all did. Pilots are trained to act like nothing surprises us. But inside, I knew this was different. The first time I saw the Blackbird was 2 days later. They drove us out to a hangar away from the main base, a place where the security gates had no markings, just armed guards who didn't make eye contact. The hangar was dark, lit only by the soft glow of maintenance lights. And there it was, black, long, and sharp like a blade. It didn't look like it belonged on Earth. The surface panels had a strange texture, and the nose seemed to stretch out forever. The crew around it worked in complete silence, each one focused, no wasted movements. One of the engineers walked me close enough to touch the skin of the aircraft. It was warm. Not from flight, just from the material itself absorbing and holding heat. I asked what it was made of. He didn't answer. He just smiled, like I'd asked a question I'd never get an answer to. The first briefing about missions was even more surreal. The officer explained our role without any bravado. No talk of glory or patriotism. Just data, distances, and risks. "You will be flying reconnaissance over denied airspace," he said. "You'll be targets every time you take off. The only thing keeping you alive will be your speed, your altitude, and your discipline." Then came the rules. No discussing missions. Not with your family, not even with other crews. No keeping notes or journals. Every scrap of information was classified. They made it clear, if you couldn't handle the weight of secrecy, you'd better walk away now. Nobody walked away. Later, I sat in the locker room staring at my reflection. Part of me wanted to call my wife, to tell her something big was happening. But what could I say? That I was about to fly an aircraft no one was supposed to know existed? That some days she'd think I was home safe when I'd really be halfway across the world, flying faster than a rifle bullet? I kept my mouth shut. That silence would become part of my life. I didn't know then that the Blackbird would change the way I thought about fear. I didn't know that the sound of the engine starting up would become something I'd hear in my sleep. Back then, all I felt was the weight of what was coming and the strange sense that I was stepping into a world most people would never even hear about. Looking back now, I realized something: they never asked us if we were ready. They didn't have to. The moment you walked into that room and didn't turn around, you'd already answered that question. They called it the ritual, but nobody ever said the word out loud. It wasn't in the manuals, and nobody briefed you on it. You just lived it, day after day, until it became second nature. That's when I realized, flying the Blackbird wasn't just about skill. It was about discipline. About surrendering a part of yourself to something you could never fully control. The first step started before dawn. The air was always cold at Beale, even in summer. I'd park my car in the same spot, walk through the same silent hallway, and swipe my badge at the same unmarked door. There were no signs, no markings. If you didn't belong there, you'd never know it existed. Inside, the ritual began with the suit. They called it the full-pressure suit, but to us, it was just the coffin. It looked like something a deep-sea diver would wear, thick, stiff, with a gold-tinted helmet that had every trace of humanity. It took 2 technicians to get me into it. They'd talk to each other in quiet, clipped words, checking valves and seals, never looking me in the eyes. Once they zipped it up, the world changed. The air smelled of pure oxygen, metallic and sharp. My breathing echoed in my helmet like I was underwater. I learned quickly that once you were in that suit, you didn't scratch your nose. You didn't wipe sweat from your eyes. Whatever discomfort you felt, you lived with it. By the time you were strapped into the Blackbird, you were already half numb, not just from the cold, but from the isolation. After the suit up came the chair. You'd sit in a small, dim room for an hour, sometimes more, breathing pure oxygen. They said it was to purge nitrogen from your blood, to keep you from blacking out during the climb. But it did something else too. It stripped away the noise. No talking. No distractions. Just the sound of your own breath and the faint hum of the compressor. It was like being suspended between two worlds, the one you were leaving behind and the one waiting at 80,000 feet. Then came the final briefings. They were always the same: weather reports, potential radar threats, coded radio frequencies. But the tone was different. It wasn't like other squadrons. There were no jokes, no bravado. Everyone spoke in quiet, precise sentences, as if the walls were listening. Maybe they were. When the time came, they'd drive us out to the hangar in a nondescript van with blacked-out windows. The base could have been empty for all we knew. No one waved. No one watched. The only sound was the tires crunching on the tarmac. The hangar itself felt like a cathedral. Lights dimmed, mechanics moving like shadows, the Blackbird gleaming under its own dark aura. Walking toward it in that bulky suit, you felt small, insignificant. The jet wasn't just a machine, it was something else. Something alive. The titanium skin radiated heat even in the cool morning air, and when you touched it with a gloved hand, you felt a faint vibration, like it was waiting for you. Climbing the ladder into the cockpit was always the same. Slow, careful, almost ceremonial. The crew chief would give a small nod but never speak. Once I was in the seat, strapped tight, the canopy closed with a hiss that cut me off from the world below. That was the moment I stopped being a man and became part of the Blackbird. The start sequence was clinical. Switch by switch, system by system, the aircraft came alive. You could feel the heat from the engines even before they roared to life. The cockpit would shake, instruments flickering as the turbines spooled up. My RSO, sitting behind me, would go through his own checklist in a calm, steady voice. No matter how many times we did it, my heart would always hammer during those minutes. Every flight felt like the first. Then came the taxi. Slow, deliberate, every bump of the tarmac magnified through the landing gear. We never spoke during that time. There was nothing to say. The only sound was the low rumble of the engines and the occasional squawk from ground control. Takeoff was where the ritual ended and the unknown began. The Blackbird demanded everything from you the moment the brakes released. The acceleration pinned you to the seat, the runway blurring past, and then, suddenly, you were airborne, climbing, 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 until the world below turned into a soft haze of blue and white. Up there, at the edge of space, the Earth looked fragile. Clouds stretched like thin sheets of paper, and the horizon curved so sharply it almost didn't look real. But there was no time to admire it. Every second was about precision, speed, altitude, fuel flow, engine temps. One mistake, and the ritual would become your last. After the mission, the ritual reversed itself. Landing, taxi, canopy release, ladder descent, suit removal. Always in silence. There were no congratulations, no pats on the back. The crew would nod, you'd nod back, and that was it. Debriefings were short, clinical, detached. Then you'd go home like nothing had happened, eat dinner with your family, and pretend you'd spent the day in an office. It took me months to understand what the ritual really was. It wasn't just about preparing the body or the jet. It was about stripping away everything unnecessary, fear, doubt, even identity, until all that was left was the mission. The Blackbird didn't just demand precision, it demanded surrender. And once you surrendered, once you gave yourself over to that machine and its rules, you couldn't ever really take yourself back. I had trained for months, memorized every switch, every checklist, every emergency procedure, but nothing prepares you for the first time the Blackbird leaves the ground. They don't tell you that in the briefings. They give you numbers, procedures, and warnings, but they can't explain what it feels like when 8 tons of titanium and fuel become something almost alive. That morning, the ritual felt heavier than usual. The suit, the oxygen purge, the silent van ride to the hangar, it was all the same, but my hands wouldn't stop sweating inside the gloves. Even with the cool air piped into the helmet, my neck was damp. The crew chief noticed but didn't say a word. He'd seen it before. Everyone feels it on their first flight, though no one admits it. When I climbed the ladder and dropped into the cockpit, the world outside shrank. The canopy came down with that sharp hiss, sealing me in. My RSO's voice crackled in my headset, steady as stone, comms check. "You good up there?" "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. The start sequence was almost automatic by then. Switch by switch, system by system, the Blackbird came alive. The vibrations rolled through the fuselage as the engines spooled up, a low growl that grew into something deeper, something that felt like it came from inside your chest. It wasn't just sound. It was pressure, humming through the frame and into your bones. Taxiing out felt surreal. The morning fog hung low over the runway, and the lights blurred through the haze. No one waved, no one saluted. The ground crew just stood still, like statues, watching the jet move toward the runway. It felt like a funeral procession, slow and deliberate. Then we were at the threshold. The tower cleared us. I took a deep breath, hand on the throttles. The RSO's voice was calm, "Ready when you are." I pushed the throttles forward. The engines roared, the brakes released, and we were shoved back into our seats as the jet surged forward. The acceleration was violent, raw. The runway blurred under us, lights flashing by faster and faster until there was nothing but motion and noise and the sudden, sharp realization that there was no turning back. And then, airborne. The wheels left the ground, and for a moment, there was silence. The cockpit went strangely quiet except for the steady hum of the engines. The world below fell away, shrinking into a patchwork of green and gray. I felt weightless, not from the climb, but from the sudden awareness of where I was and what I was sitting in. As we climbed, the sky shifted colors, deep blue, then almost black. The higher we went, the more the world below faded into a distant memory. The horizon curved, the clouds stretched thin like spun glass, and the sun burned sharp and cold above us. I'd flown fighters before, but nothing compared to that moment. The Blackbird didn't just fly, it tore itself away from the earth. Then the jet reminded me it wasn't a dream. At Mach 2, the first shudder hit. Not violent, but enough to jolt me out of the trance. The RSO's voice came over the intercom, calm but firm, engine temp stable. "Keep her steady." I focused on the gauges. Every needle, every number had to be perfect. At those speeds, there was no margin for error. A small mistake could become a fireball in seconds. My gloves were slick with sweat, but my hands moved on instinct, adjusting, correcting, keeping the jet balanced as we climbed higher and faster. At altitude, the world was silent. No engine roar, no turbulence, just a low, steady hum, almost like breathing. It felt peaceful, but that peace was a lie. I knew that at that speed, death was always less than a heartbeat away. A compressor stall, a flameout, a bad turn, any of it could scatter us across miles of desert in less than a second. We leveled out at just under 80,000 feet. From up there, the world didn't look real. The sky was so dark it looked like space. The curve of the earth stretched out below us, and the sun cut across the horizon in a thin, bright line. It was beautiful, but there was something cold about it too, like standing at the edge of something you're not supposed to see. The RSO broke the silence. "You're flying it," he said, his voice flat but with a trace of respect. I didn't answer. I just tightened my grip on the stick and focused on keeping the jet level. Because that's the part no one tells you about, the Blackbird never really flies steady. It's always alive, always moving, like a wild animal that tolerates you but never trusts you. The return to Beale was quiet. Descent, approach, and landing were mechanical, checklists followed in silence. The wheels touched down smoother than I expected, but the relief didn't come until we were taxiing back toward the hangar. Only then did I realize my jaw hurt from how hard I'd been clenching it. The canopy lifted, and cool air rushed in. The crew chief gave the same small nod as always, expressionless, like nothing had happened. To them, it was just another flight. To me, it was the moment everything changed. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the horizon bending, the sky turning black, the world dropping away. I'd taken off from Earth that morning, but part of me never really came back. The first time they sent me over hostile airspace, I thought I was ready. I'd trained for months, studied the routes, memorized every radar frequency and missile range. I knew the numbers by heart, Mach, altitude, distance, fuel margins. But none of that prepared me for the moment the line between safe skies and enemy territory disappeared beneath the nose of the Blackbird. The briefing that morning had been colder than usual. No small talk, no glances exchanged. Just the facts. Target coordinates. Weather. Threat assessments. The words were clinical, high probability of radar tracking, moderate chance of attempted intercept, minimal risk of a successful strike. Minimal. That word stuck in my head like a splinter. The ritual carried me through the first steps, the suit, the purge, the long silent drive to the hangar. But even through the thick gold visor, I could feel the difference in the air. The crew moved slower, quieter. They didn't have to say it, everybody knew where we were going. The engines came alive, and we taxied out into the pale morning light. I went through the motions, muscle memory guiding my hands across the switches, but my pulse was hammering so hard it felt like the helmet might crack. The RSO sat behind me, steady and calm, his voice flat as we rolled toward the runway. When the brakes released, the roar swallowed everything. The Blackbird surged forward, and the base vanished behind us. Climbing out, I tried to focus on the gauges, the numbers, anything but the mission waiting ahead. But once we crossed that invisible line, the tension hit like a wall. At altitude, the world looked calm. Clouds drifted below, the sky stretched black and endless, and the curve of the earth cut sharp against the horizon. But we both knew that beneath that calm, the ground was alive with radar beams sweeping for us, guided by crews who'd been trained to kill what they couldn't catch. The first radar lock came 30 minutes in. The tone in my headset was sharp, mechanical, but my stomach dropped like a stone. "Spike, 11 o'clock, the RSO said, his voice perfectly steady. He didn't have to tell me where it came from, I already knew. We were being painted by one of their early warning systems, a signal to every interceptor in range that the Blackbird was up there, slicing through their airspace. I pushed the throttles forward, and the jet answered, the engines building with that deep, vibrating growl that lived in my bones. Mach 3.1. Then 3.2. The world outside blurred, the ground flattening into streaks of color, but the tone in my headset stayed, relentless. Somewhere below, someone was locking on. The first missile launch came minutes later. I never saw it, but the RSO called it out, "Sam up, 5 o'clock, climbing fast." I didn't look back. There was no point. At that altitude and speed, looking meant nothing. All that mattered was holding the course and keeping the jet in its narrow, unforgiving envelope. Too sharp a climb, and we'd flame out. Too shallow, and we'd bleed speed and become a target. "Stay on it," the RSO said, his voice almost calm. "We're outrunning it." The jet shuddered as we pushed faster, the heat creeping into the cockpit, gauges climbing toward the red. I could feel the sweat dripping down my back, trapped inside the suit. My gloves were slick on the stick, but my hands never left their position. Every movement was precise, measured. Then, just as quickly as it started, the tone faded. The lock was gone. The missile had burned out somewhere below, chasing a ghost that had already crossed the horizon. We didn't speak for a long time. The only sound was the steady hum of the engines and the faint hiss of oxygen in my helmet. Out there, above the world, you'd think it would feel like victory. It didn't. It felt cold. Detached. Because you knew there would always be another radar, another lock, another launch. On the return leg, the silence in the cockpit was heavy. The RSO read out headings, altitudes, fuel levels, but there was no conversation beyond what was necessary. By the time we dropped below Mach, the jet felt sluggish, almost resentful, like it didn't want to come down. The landing was smooth, mechanical, but stepping out of the cockpit, I felt like my legs didn't belong to me. The crew didn't say a word. No nods, no quiet congratulations. Just the same careful hands removing the suit, the same routine. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling for hours, replaying every sound, every number, every shudder of the jet. I thought about the men on the ground, the ones staring at blips on their radar, the ones who fired and missed. I wondered if they were awake, too, thinking about the black shape that had cut through their skies like a shadow. I'd always been told that fear keeps you sharp, that it keeps you alive. Maybe that's true. But up there, over hostile skies, fear didn't feel sharp. It felt heavy, like a weight pressing down, growing with every mile. And the worst part was knowing that weight would be there again, waiting, every time the Blackbird rolled out of the hangar. It started as just another mission. The briefing was routine, the kind where the officers speak in monotone voices and the map on the wall looks the same as every other day. Clear weather, light headwinds, minimal threats. Nothing unusual. But the Blackbird had a way of making even the simplest missions feel like something was waiting just beyond the horizon. The ritual went as it always did, the suit, the oxygen purge, the silent van ride to the hangar. The ground crew didn't speak, just moved around the jet like shadows. By then, I'd stopped trying to make sense of their silence. The Blackbird demanded a kind of respect that no one dared to break. The takeoff was smooth, the climb steady. By the time we leveled at altitude, the Earth was a soft curve below us, the sky black and endless. The RSO was in his usual rhythm, his voice calm as he called out data, Mach 3.1, temps steady, fuel balanced. It felt almost peaceful up there, that strange quiet where nothing moves but the needles on the gauges and the thin blue arc of the horizon. Then the radar warning tone chirped. Just a short, sharp beep, so quick I almost thought it was a glitch. Spike? I asked, keeping my eyes on the gauges. Negative, the RSO said. He paused for a moment, then repeated, no radar lock. No tracking. Nothing on the scope. I let it go. At those speeds, odd blips weren't unheard of. A reflection, a glitch, maybe some atmospheric interference. But 5 minutes later, the tone came again, this time longer. Talk to me, I said, sharper now. I've got something, the RSO replied. Low return. No signature I recognize. Bearing 6 o'clock, closing fast. That didn't make sense. Nothing closed fast on the Blackbird. Not at that altitude, not at that speed. My first thought was a malfunction, maybe a ghost echo bouncing off the upper atmosphere. But the tone kept coming, steady now, like a metronome ticking in my headset. Could be ground clutter, I said, though even I didn't believe it. Not ground clutter, the RSO said quietly. It's moving with us. Mach numbers don't make sense, but it's there. I felt it then, the cold weight in my gut, the same one I'd felt the first time a missile lock screamed in my ears. I pushed the throttles forward, climbing slightly, testing the Blackbird's edge. The engines roared, and the world outside blurred into streaks of gray and blue. For a few minutes, the tone faded. Silence. I almost convinced myself we'd outrun it. But then it came back, closer this time. Range closing, the RSO said. His voice wasn't calm anymore. Not panicked, but tight. Bearing unchanged. It's staying in our shadow. Missile? I asked. Negative. Wrong pattern. Too controlled. The Blackbird vibrated as I pushed harder, dancing on the edge of what the engines would allow. Mach 3.3, Mach 3.4, numbers that demanded respect, numbers that punished mistakes. Sweat ran down my back, pooling in the suit, but I didn't ease off. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it was gone. No tone. No return. Nothing but the steady hum of the engines and the hiss of oxygen in my helmet. Contact lost, the RSO said finally. Clean scope. We stayed silent for the rest of the leg, heading back toward friendlier skies. I tried to focus on the numbers, on the delicate dance of fuel and altitude, but my eyes kept flicking to the instruments, waiting for the tone to return. It never did. The landing was smooth, almost mechanical. The ground crew worked in silence, just like they always did. No one asked how the mission went, and we didn't volunteer anything. You didn't talk about things you couldn't explain. Later, in the debrief, we filed the standard report, altitude, speed, fuel usage, sensor data. Nothing unusual. I glanced at my RSO as we signed the log, but he didn't meet my eyes. He just signed his name and walked out. That night, I sat in my kitchen staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. I replayed every second in my head, every tone, every number. The Blackbird had been chased before, by missiles, by interceptors, even by the rare lucky radar. But this was different. Whatever it was, it had kept pace with us in a way nothing else ever had. I thought about asking around, maybe bringing it up casually with one of the older pilots, but I didn't. I already knew what they'd say, glitch. Phantom echo. Nothing to worry about. But the look on my RSO's face when he walked out of the debrief told me he'd heard it too, and he wasn't calling it a glitch. Weeks later, on another mission, I caught a quiet moment with a veteran pilot, someone who'd been flying the Blackbird since the early days. I didn't give details, just said, "Ever see anything strange on the scope?" He didn't look at me, didn't smile. He just said, "Sometimes the jet isn't the only thing up there," and walked away. I never asked again. Every pilot who ever flew the Blackbird was taught the same thing on day one: the jet will try to kill you. It doesn't matter how many hours you've logged, how sharp your reflexes are, or how well you know the checklists. Up there, at the edge of the atmosphere, the margin between control and disaster is razor thin. I understood that in theory. But the day the left engine flamed out, I learned what it really meant. It started like any other mission: smooth prep, clean takeoff, a steady climb through the thin morning air. The jet was running perfectly, every gauge steady, every vibration familiar. The RSO was his usual calm self, calling out numbers with that flat tone that told me everything was routine. The first leg was uneventful. We crossed the coast, settled into Mach 3, and the Blackbird purred like it was built to live at that speed. Then it happened. It wasn't dramatic at first. Just a subtle jolt, like turbulence. A flicker on the left engine gauge. I caught it in the corner of my eye and frowned. Before I could say anything, the cockpit shuddered hard, and the warning lights lit up like a Christmas tree. Left engine, flame out, the RSO snapped. His voice was sharp, clipped. Compressor stall. RPM 0. The Blackbird lurched sideways so violently it felt like we'd been punched by a giant hand. At Mach 3, there's no gentle drift. The nose snapped left, my helmet slammed against the headrest, and the entire jet pitched down. Training kicked in before panic could. I slammed the throttles, compensating, fighting to keep the jet level while my mind raced through the emergency checklist. At that speed, with asymmetric thrust, even a fraction of hesitation could send us into an unrecoverable spin. Restart sequence, now, the RSO barked. Copy, I said, though my voice didn't sound like mine. The cockpit was chaos, alarms screaming, warning lights flashing red, the suit amplifying every sound in that tight space. My gloves were slick with sweat as I ran the sequence from memory, each motion precise, automatic, like a reflex. Switches. Fuel cut. Ignition. Airflow. For a moment, nothing happened. Just the deafening sound of one engine clawing at the sky while the other sat dead, dragging us into instability. The nose wanted to roll, the airframe trembled like it was seconds from tearing itself apart. Stabilize her, the RSO shouted. I've got it, I growled, forcing my voice steady. Hold on. Then, ignition. A deep, guttural rumble vibrated through the frame as the left engine coughed back to life. The gauges flickered, climbed, then steadied. The jet stopped fighting me and leveled out, gliding smooth again as if nothing had happened. For a full 30 seconds, neither of us spoke. The alarms were quiet now, the hum of both engines steady. But I could feel my pulse pounding so hard it made the helmet press tight against my temples. Finally, the RSO exhaled. Good catch, he said quietly. Yeah, I replied, my throat dry. Too damn close. We didn't talk much on the way back. The checklist said we could continue, but neither of us trusted the jet that day. We cut the route short and turned for home, riding the Blackbird like a wounded animal all the way to Beale. The landing was smooth, almost insultingly normal. The ground crew swarmed the jet, their faces as expressionless as ever, but I could see the glances they exchanged when they checked the engine temps. They knew. In the debrief, I wrote the incident report exactly as procedure demanded: flame out, recovery, restart. No emotion, no commentary, just numbers and times. That's how they wanted it, clinical, detached. But when the officer in charge signed off, he looked at me for a long moment before sliding the paper back. No words. Just that look that said, "You got lucky." That night, I couldn't shake it. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the violent roll, the helpless drift, the sickening moment when I thought the jet had won. The Blackbird didn't forgive mistakes, and it didn't explain itself. One moment it was a perfect machine, the next it was a monster trying to shake you loose at the edge of space. A week later, the engineers tore the engine apart and told me it was a pressure valve failure, something minor, something that shouldn't have happened. I nodded, signed their report, and walked away. But deep down, I knew the truth every pilot knew but never said out loud: the Blackbird had moods. It chose its moments. And on that flight, for reasons I'll never understand, it decided to remind me who was really in control. After that, every pre-flight ritual felt heavier. Every climb carried that whisper in the back of my mind: what if it happens again? You learn to live with it, to tuck the fear somewhere deep and pretend it wasn't there. But you never forgot. Because once you've felt that drop, once you've stared into the thin black void with one engine dead and the other screaming to keep you alive, you know exactly how thin the line really is between flying the Blackbird and being consumed by it. Some missions left you drained. Others left you shaken. But that one left me silent in a way I'd never known. It started the same as always, routine briefing, clean launch, smooth climb. The Blackbird was steady, the aircom, and my RSO and I were in sync, every call crisp, every number clean. But the deeper we went into denied airspace, the heavier the silence grew, like the sky itself was holding its breath. We were at 80,000 feet, cruising at Mach 3.2, the world below just a blur of shifting colors. The horizon curved sharp against the black of the upper atmosphere, the sun burning cold above us. Everything was normal until the first tone hit. Short, sharp, but unmistakable, a radar spike. "Lock, 2 o'clock, my RSO said, his voice calm but tight. I pushed the throttles a hair forward, just enough to buy ourselves a little distance without throwing the engines into the red. The jet responded instantly, a deep vibration running through the frame, that familiar living hum that told me we were right on the edge. The tone stopped, then came again from another bearing. Then another. We were being tracked by multiple systems. That wasn't unusual on paper, hell, we expected it. But something about it felt wrong. Coordinated. Precise. Like someone knew exactly where we'd be, and exactly when. No missile warnings. No launches. Just the radar spikes, tracking us silently as we cut through their airspace like a ghost. "Stay on course," my RSO said quietly. His voice was steady, but I could hear the edge underneath it. We pushed harder, climbing a little, skimming the edge of what the engines would allow. The cockpit temperature spiked, sweat pooling under the suit, my gloves slick against the controls. I kept my breathing steady, every motion precise, forcing the Blackbird to hold the line. Then, silence. No tones. No spikes. Nothing but the hum of the engines and the faint hiss of oxygen in the helmet. "Scope's clean," the RSO said after a long pause. I didn't answer. Something in my gut told me it wasn't over. Up there, instincts kept you alive, and mine were screaming that the sky around us wasn't empty. We stayed silent all the way through the turn for home. Every few minutes, I'd scan the gauges, glance at the horizon, check the instruments again. Nothing. Just the smooth, steady climb toward safety. Crossing back into friendly airspace should have felt like relief. It didn't. The Blackbird was quiet, almost too quiet, like it had burned through something we couldn't see. Even the RSO didn't say much, just the occasional call for altitude or speed. It felt like a funeral procession, that slow, heavy ride back to Beale. The landing was perfect, clean, precise, without a single hitch. The ground crew moved around the jet in their usual silence, disconnecting lines, running checks, helping us out of the suits. No one looked at us, and we didn't look at them. The debrief was short. Routine. Fuel numbers, route data, altitude logs. Nobody mentioned the radar locks. Nobody asked why our responses were clipped and quiet. It was as if the mission had gone exactly as planned, nothing unusual at all. But that night, lying in bed, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the instruments, the horizon, the empty sky that didn't feel empty. I thought about the tone, sharp and mechanical, and the way it had stopped all at once, like someone had flipped a switch. A few days later, during a casual conversation in the ready room, I hinted about the mission to one of the older pilots. Just a passing comment, nothing direct. "Ever have a day when the sky feels crowded?" He didn't smile. Didn't joke. He just looked at me, expression flat, and said, "Sometimes they let you come home," before turning away. I never brought it up again. From that day on, every time we turned the nose toward hostile skies, I carried that weight with me. The knowledge that sometimes, out there in the thin black air, something was watching. Not trying to catch us, not trying to kill us, just watching. And on that mission, for reasons I'll never understand, whatever it was decided to let us return in silence. The desert has a way of swallowing secrets. Out there, where the horizon bleeds into the heat and the air shimmers like glass, things happen that never make it into any report, things no one wants to talk about. The incident they buried under that name, the desert incident, was one of those things. It started with a simple relocation flight. Nothing high risk, nothing unusual. I was ferrying the Blackbird to a remote test site, a strip of concrete in the middle of nowhere, ringed by fences and silence. The kind of place you land without asking questions, because you're not supposed to have any. The takeoff was smooth, the climb perfect, the sky clear. By the time I dropped altitude and lined up with the barren runway, the sun was bleeding red across the horizon. The landing itself was textbook, the kind of approach they'd use in training videos, smooth, clean, precise. But the second the wheels touched the ground, something felt wrong. There was no movement. No ground crew rushing in, no vehicles, no lights. Just stillness. For a few long seconds, I thought maybe I'd landed on the wrong strip. Then, from a small bunker near the edge of the runway, a single Jeep rolled out, moving slow, deliberate, like it wasn't in any hurry. I shut the engines down and climbed out of the cockpit. The heat hit me first, that dry, oppressive desert air that seemed to cling to the inside of your lungs. The two men in the Jeep didn't speak. They just motioned for me to follow. Inside the small control building, it was colder than it should have been. Air conditioning humming hard, the walls lined with old maps and faded photos. The older of the two men, a civilian by the look of him, handed me a clipboard, told me to sign, and said nothing else. That's when I heard it. A sound, low and metallic, echoing faintly from somewhere below the building. A deep, mechanical groan, like metal under stress. It came in short bursts, followed by a silence so sharp it made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Maintenance," the younger man said flatly when he caught me looking. But his eyes didn't match his voice. They escorted me to a small, windowless room to wait. No phone, no clock, just a metal table and two chairs. The hum of the air conditioning was the only sound. Minutes felt like hours. Then the older man returned and told me to get ready for a night flight. No explanation, no briefing. Just that cold order, night flight. When I stepped back outside, the Blackbird was already fueled, the tarmac bathed in pale floodlights that barely cut the desert darkness. But what caught my attention wasn't the plane, it was the line of tire tracks leading away from the runway, deep grooves pressed into the sand, vanishing toward the hills. Fresh tracks. Too wide to be from a Jeep. The flight itself was short, just a hop to another site. But as I taxied out, I saw something on the edge of the lights, something huge, under a tarp, strapped to a flatbed. The shape was wrong. Too large, too sharp. The tarp shifted slightly in the night wind, just enough to show metal edges scorched black, like they'd been burned. We were airborne within minutes. No chatter, no acknowledgements, just a steady climb into the dark. My RSO didn't speak, and I didn't ask questions. Up there, at 80,000 feet, the world below was nothing but empty black. Still, I couldn't shake the image of those tracks, that tarp, that scorched metal. When we landed at the second site, another strip and another patch of desert, there was no debrief, no handshake, no acknowledgement. Just a silent refueling in an unmarked van to take us away. Nobody looked at us, and we didn't look at them. Weeks passed before anyone mentioned that night again. Then, in a quiet corner of the hangar, one of the older pilots leaned close and said, "Whatever you think you saw out there, forget it. It's safer that way." His voice was steady, but his eyes told me he wasn't giving advice. He was giving a warning. To this day, I don't know what happened in that desert, or what they dragged away under the cover of darkness. The official logs show nothing unusual, just a standard relocation and a night hop. Clean and quiet. But sometimes, when I think back to that night, I remember the sound from beneath the control building, that metallic groan echoing through the concrete. And I wonder if maybe, just maybe, the desert wasn't swallowing a secret that night. Maybe it was spitting one out. There's a point where the Blackbird stops feeling like a machine and starts feeling like a living thing. A point where you're no longer flying her, she's carrying you, deciding if you're worthy of staying alive. That point comes when you push her too far, when the gauges are redlining, and the airframe is screaming through the thin atmosphere at the edge of space. I found that point one night, and I still don't know how we made it back. The mission started like so many others, deep penetration, high risk, no room for error. Intel needed a snapshot of a site that barely existed on any map. Timing was everything. To make the window, we had to fly faster and higher than any profile we'd ever run. We knew what that meant, skirting the edge of what the J-58S could handle, keeping the skin temperature so high it could burn you alive if you somehow touched it. But the brass wanted results, and the Blackbird had a reputation for doing the impossible. So we strapped in, checked every system twice, and lit the engines. The climb was brutal. The Blackbird groaned, every bolt and seam humming like a tuning fork. At 70,000 feet, she was steady. At 80,000, she was still climbing like a predator, hungry for more. The sky darkened to that inky black, stars sharp enough to cut, and the curve of the earth glowed faintly beneath us. Then we pushed her harder. Mach 3.1. 3.2. 3.3. Every notch up felt like threading a needle with gloves on, every adjustment razor thin. The skin temperature soared past 600 degrees Fahrenheit. The cockpit stank of hot metal and sweat, the air thick with that electric tang you only smell when the jet's alive in a way that defies explanation. Temps are high, my RSO warned, his voice calm but tight. We've got margin, I lied. We didn't. At Mach 3.4, the vibration started. Subtle at first, a faint buzz in the stick, a low hum in the pedals. Then sharper, deeper, like the jet was telling us she'd had enough. The gauges danced in front of me, numbers flirting with disaster. One bad move, one twitch too hard on the controls, and we'd be nothing but a streak of fire in the upper atmosphere. But we kept going. The target came into view, a cluster of structures so small they looked like toys from that height. The cameras clicked, the sensors hummed, the data streamed in. Clean, precise, perfect. We'd done what they asked. Then came the voice in my headset. Calm. Controlled. Cold. Negative on descent. Hold speed and heading. New coordinates inbound. I froze. We'd burned more fuel than planned getting to this altitude, and the Blackbird was greedy. Every second at full throttle drained her faster. Confirm, I said. Fuel margins are. Hold course, the voice repeated, flat as steel. We banked toward the new vector, the horizon tilting, the world bending below us. The jet didn't like it. Neither did I. At Mach 3.5, the frame felt like it was shaking apart. The heat was unbearable, sweat stinging my eyes, hands locked on the controls. The RSO said nothing now. There was nothing to say. Either we held it together, or we became a footnote no one would ever read. Then, just as suddenly, the order came, mission complete. Return base. I eased her back, inch by inch, feeling the engines cool, the frame relax, the hum settle into that deep, steady rhythm again. The descent felt like falling out of the void, the stars fading, the blue of the sky creeping back, the ground slowly becoming real again. We landed smooth, but the silence after shutdown was suffocating. No cheers, no congratulations. Just the faint ticking of the cooling engines and the hiss of the hydraulics bleeding off. During the debrief, the brass never mentioned the second vector. No one explained what we'd been chasing out there in the black. The fuel numbers didn't match, the data packets were scrubbed clean, and the official log listed it as a routine run. But I remember the way the Blackbird felt that night, the way she trembled and burned and somehow held together when physics said she shouldn't. People like to talk about the Blackbird like she was untouchable, invincible. But when you push her that far, when you demand more than even she was built to give, you learn the truth. She's alive, and she decides if you get to come home. That night, she let us. But as we taxied in, I swear it felt like a warning. They told us it would be a simple run. In and out, clean, routine. By then, I should have known better. There was never anything simple about flying the Blackbird, especially in those final years, when every mission felt like it could be the last. And for me, it was. I remember the morning clearly. The desert was still cold, the kind of sharp chill that bites through the flight suit. The sky was cloudless, a pale blue that promised a brutal heat later in the day. The jet was already prepped when we arrived at the hangar, her black skin glinting under the early sun, looking less like an aircraft and more like something alive. The briefing was short, too short. A target deep in hostile territory, a series of high-resolution passes, and immediate return. Nothing unusual on paper. But I could see it in the faces of the handlers, too tense, too quiet. No one looked me in the eye. My recon systems officer, Harris, didn't say much during the walk to the plane. He never did. But that morning, his silence felt heavier, like he knew something I didn't. We climbed in, ran through the checklist, and with a roar that rattled the hangar walls, the J-58S came alive. Takeoff was flawless. Climb was steady. At 70,000 feet, the world below was already fading into a hazy curve, the deep black of space above us like an open wound. I always loved that view. It made you feel small and infinite at the same time. We hit Mach 3 without effort, the Blackbird purring like a predator in her element. Harris worked the sensors, calm and efficient, while I kept my eyes on the gauges. Everything looked perfect. For a while, it almost felt routine. Then the first warning light blinked. Just a flicker, gone in a second, but it was enough to set my pulse racing. Fuel pressure, right engine. I checked the systems, everything nominal. Harris caught my glance but didn't say a word. We'd had false warnings before. Minutes later, we were over the target. Cameras rolling, sensors active. From up there, the installation looked almost harmless, a cluster of buildings, a runway, a few vehicles. But the chatter in my headset told a different story. Radar locks. Multiple. I pushed her harder, banking into the second pass. The Blackbird roared, engines straining, skin temperatures spiking. And then the second warning light came. This time, it didn't go away. Right engine, Harris said, his voice tight. I acknowledged, adjusting power, keeping her steady. We still had a job to finish. Another pass, another burst of data, and then we turned for home. That's when it happened. A violent shudder tore through the jet, like a giant hand had grabbed her midair. The right engine flamed out, the sudden silence in my headset deafening. At Mach 3, an unstart isn't just a problem, it's a death sentence if you don't act fast. Restart procedure. Harris barked, his voice sharp now. I fought the controls, hands steady despite the panic clawing at the back of my mind. The jet bucked and screamed, but she held. By some miracle, the engine came back, coughing to life like an old man dragging in his last breath. We leveled out, dropping speed, easing her back into safer territory. But something was wrong. The vibrations didn't stop. It felt like the jet was tearing herself apart, every bolt loosening, every seam screaming. Divert? Harris asked. I thought about it. There was a strip 200 miles out, friendly soil, easy in. But something told me we wouldn't make it. No, I said. We take her home. The descent was agony. Every mile felt like a war, the controls heavy, the noise unbearable. By the time we crossed the coastline, my hands were numb from gripping the stick. We touched down just after dusk. The runway lights blurred in the heat rising from her skin, and the Blackbird rolled to a stop, silent and still. Ground crews swarmed, but I barely noticed. I sat there in the cockpit, breathing hard, knowing deep down this was it. They grounded her after that mission. Too risky, they said. Too many hours, too much stress on the airframe. Officially, it was maintenance. Unofficially, it felt like a quiet burial. Harris and I never talked about that day. Maybe we didn't need to. The data we brought back was classified, buried in some vault where no one would ever see it. Whatever it was we risked everything for, it wasn't meant for us to know. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that flight. About the silence after the engine died, about the way the Blackbird fought to stay in the air, like she wasn't ready to let go just yet. And I wonder if maybe she knew it was her last run, too. The records call it Mission 492. I just call it the last mission. Because for me, for her, and maybe for both of us, that's exactly what it was. I thought I'd buried that part of my life for good. Years had passed since my last flight, years since I'd even said the words Blackbird out loud. I'd learned to live with the silence, with the memories that came like ghosts in the middle of the night. But then, one morning, a letter showed up in my mailbox. No return address. No stamp. Just my name, in neat block letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper. An address. A time. And 2 words, typed in bold, declassified briefing. I almost didn't go. Part of me wanted to burn the paper and pretend it had never come. But curiosity, or maybe guilt, got the better of me. So, on a gray winter afternoon, I found myself driving to a nondescript building outside DC, the kind of place you'd never notice unless you were looking for it. Security was tight, but they seemed to know exactly who I was. No ID checks, no questions, just a silent nod and a gesture to follow the long, sterile hallway that led to an underground room. The room was small, windowless, and cold. A few men in suits sat at a table, their faces expressionless. In the center of the table was a black folder, thicker than my flight log had ever been. "Colonel," one of them said, though I hadn't been a colonel in a long time. "Thank you for coming." They slid the folder toward me. On the cover, in stark white letters, were 2 words I thought I'd never see together, Mission 492. For a moment, I couldn't move. My hands wouldn't reach for it. I remembered the sound of the engine dying, the vibrations that shook the cockpit, the way the Blackbird had limped home like she'd been bleeding out. That mission had haunted me for decades. When I finally opened the folder, the first thing I saw was a photo, grainy, black and white, taken from our high-altitude cameras. It showed a facility, deep in the desert, surrounded by nothing but sand and emptiness. Only now, the photo had markings, notations, and a stamp, recovered technology site. "We couldn't tell you at the time," the man said, his voice flat but not unkind. "But you weren't just photographing a weapons depot. What you captured, it wasn't ours. It wasn't anyone's. At least, not anyone we know." I stared at the photo. Something in my chest went cold. He explained, in clipped sentences, what they'd pieced together over the years. A crash site that had been hidden for decades. Unidentifiable alloys. Electromagnetic signatures that didn't match anything on record. And a presence, something moving, watching, that their own systems couldn't track. "That's why your second vector was added mid-flight," he said. "We detected an energy spike. You were the closest asset. We needed eyes on it. You gave us confirmation." I remembered the voice in my headset that night. Calm. Cold. The one that redirected us without explanation. "Did you know it almost killed us?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He didn't flinch. "Yes." The rest of the briefing blurred. Documents, photos, data streams, things that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie, not in the hands of men in suits. They spoke of recovered fragments, of testing programs, of propulsion theories that had rewritten physics in ways the public would never understand. And then, almost casually, they said the words that hollowed me out. "The technology you brought back extended the Blackbird's life. Every mission after yours relied on what you delivered that night. Without it, the program would have ended years earlier." I didn't know what to say. Pride didn't fit. Neither did anger. What I felt was something colder, a sense that I'd been nothing more than a pawn in a game I'd never been allowed to see. Before I left, they handed me a smaller folder. "For your eyes only," the man said. "Consider it closure." In the car, parked in the shadow of that lifeless building, I opened it. Inside was a single photo, the Blackbird, silhouetted against a setting sun, her skin gleaming like obsidian. Below it, in handwritten ink, were 3 words. "She saved you." I don't know why, but that broke me. Maybe because it was true. That night, the Blackbird had fought gravity, physics, and sheer mechanical failure to bring us home. She'd done it when she shouldn't have been able to. Even now, I don't know how much of what they told me was the truth. Maybe all of it. Maybe none of it. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the world feels too still, I take out that photo. I look at her, frozen in time, and I remember the hum of the engines, the sting of the suit, the way the horizon curved like the edge of forever. And I wonder if we were ever really in control, or if we were just passengers, lucky enough to survive a ride we were never meant to take. "Some things," they said, "are better left classified. But not for me. Not anymore. There are things I can't explain. Not because I don't want to, but because there are no words for them. The years since my last flight have been quiet on the surface, but underneath, there's this hum, like the faint vibration of an engine you can't turn off." People ask me what it was like, flying the Blackbird. I tell them about the speed, the altitude, the danger. Those are safe answers. But there are parts of the story that stay locked inside me, because even if I spoke them out loud, no one would believe me. Sometimes, late at night, I wake up with the sound of the J-58 engines in my head, roaring like they did the moment we'd break Mach 3. I'll be sitting in my chair with a glass of bourbon, the house silent, and I'll feel that same pressure in my chest, the one I used to feel when the aircraft seemed to blur the line between machine and something else. Back then, we told ourselves it was just engineering. Just precision in design. But now, looking back, I'm not so sure. There was one mission, I can't give the date, can't give the location. Even now, those details are sealed somewhere in a vault I'll never see. But I remember the feeling. We were high, higher than I'd ever been, the stars sharp against the black curve of the earth. Everything was quiet, calm. Then, without warning, the instruments started to drift. Not fail, drift. Readings that had been steady all flight shifted in ways that didn't make sense. Altitude, speed, heading, all skewed, like the Blackbird was moving through something we couldn't measure. I looked over at my RSO. He didn't say a word, but his hands were tight on the controls of his console, knuckles white inside his gloves. Then there was this sound. Not in the headset. Not in the airframe. It was deeper, more like a resonance, as if the whole plane was vibrating with something that wasn't mechanical. It lasted less than a minute. Maybe even less than that. But when the readings stabilized, we were off course, by hundreds of miles. There was no explanation, no radio call, no reprimand. When we landed, they ran the standard checks. Nothing wrong. Nothing unusual. But a week later, during a briefing, someone from a department I'd never seen before asked me a single question: "What did you feel?" Not what I saw. Not what I heard. What I felt. I told him the truth. That for a moment, I didn't feel like we were flying the Blackbird. I felt like we were being carried. He didn't write anything down. He just nodded and walked out of the room. I've spent years trying to rationalize that moment. Stress, oxygen mix, instrumentation glitches, they all make more sense than what my gut tells me. But that wasn't the only time something like that happened. There were other missions, other anomalies. Data that didn't match flight paths. Camera reels that came back blank, like something had erased them. Unexplained magnetic surges that fried circuits for a second and then vanished without a trace. The worst was the night over the Pacific. No mission number, no flight log. Officially, it never happened. But I know what I saw, or maybe saw isn't the right word. It was more like a shadow, moving against the stars, keeping pace with us at impossible speed. Every time I looked straight at it, it seemed to disappear. But in my peripheral vision, it was there, silent, watching. My RSO didn't say a word the whole time, but when we landed, he wouldn't meet my eyes. A week later, he put in for reassignment. I never saw him again. They told us, back in the program, that the Blackbird was the pinnacle of human engineering. And maybe it was. But sometimes I wonder if we were testing more than we realized. If we were brushing up against something we couldn't name. I've tried to talk about it, here and there, over the years. Not the specifics, just the feeling of being somewhere you're not supposed to be, of touching a line you didn't even know was there. Most people smile politely and change the subject. A few get this look in their eyes, like they know exactly what I mean but can't say so out loud. What I can tell you is this: there were times when the Blackbird didn't feel like a machine. She felt alive. Like she knew when you were scared, when you were pushing too hard, when you were losing focus. She'd forgive you sometimes, give you a margin to recover. Other times, if you weren't ready, she'd let you feel the edge of what failure really meant. And what I can't tell you, the things locked away in places I'll never touch, still haunt me. The coordinates they never explained. The missions where our orders changed mid-flight without reason. The briefings where the men asking the questions didn't have names or ranks. There's one memory I can't shake. My last solo night in the hangar, walking past her one final time. I ran my hand along the edge of her nose, the metal still warm even though she hadn't flown in hours. And in that quiet, I had this strange thought, that she wasn't done. That one day, somewhere, someone else would hear that hum in their chest, the way I still do. Maybe that's the part that unsettles me the most. The idea that the Blackbird was never really ours. That we were just borrowing her for a while, and that whatever we brushed against out there, whatever we woke up in those skies, was only just beginning. People ask if I miss it. The speed. The danger. The impossible missions. And I tell them yes, because that's easier than explaining the truth. What I miss isn't the adrenaline or the secrecy. It's that feeling of being part of something bigger, even if I didn't understand it. And maybe that's why I stay quiet. Because some things aren't meant to be explained. Some things are just meant to be carried, in silence, for as long as you're able.